Hello there. Do you ever find yourself moved when you see and hear about a mother losing her baby or parents losing a young child to terminal illness? There's something terribly sad about a young person dying before their time and leaving a family grief-stricken. In our modern society, we've become somewhat unfamiliar with death and tragedy on a regular basis because we live in a society, thank God, that has known good healthcare for decades, and people live much longer to a ripe old age. In fact, they expect to live to a ripe old age. In fact, the business of dying and death itself is quietly and efficiently glossed over, and we talk of someone passing, not someone who has died. But of course, grief and mourning loved one has returned since the advent of the COVID pandemic, because television, radio, and the general media speak about the big numbers of people who have suffered and died. And to make matters worse, people have died alone and unaccompanied by their loved ones, and all that could make their last moments more meaningful and less scary. Death and mourning have become much more real to us now, even if it is at second hand, because of the pandemic and the toll on their lives and the constant repetition of statistics, day by day, even hour by hour. Recently, I was reading a book on Eastern Orthodox Church spirituality about a reality called compunction. And you may wonder, what's compunction? Compunction is the ability to weep over one's sins and to regret them. But it's not about being morbid or being clinically depressed, but it's about taking responsibility for the way that I've lived my life and the obstacles I've put to prevent me living the full life of the resurrection and the glory of God that He wants to pour into my life, and instead living a very reduced, shrunken kind of existence. The word compunction is expressed differently in the East. It's called by a Greek word, penthos. And penthos is used about mourning the loss of salvation. And it's a mourning which the spiritual writers say must be all through our lives, just as we must perpetually work out our salvation. Well, just like a mother mourning and grieving over the loss of her child in death, there is a teaching in the Christian tradition about mourning and grieving over the loss of the fullness of divine life, and also a sense of inflicting harm and hurt on God, pain at least, when He sees the resurrected life of Christ spurned or rejected and perhaps even vilified. Perhaps this is not that far away from our experience when we think about people who have never reached their potential and becoming something much more diminished and shrunken because of the poor choices that they have made. And both they themselves and perhaps more often we can see a diminishment and a sadness. St. Gemma Galgani, who lived from 1878 to 1903, was an Italian woman born in Tuscany who spent most of her life in the city of Lucca. Her life is roughly parallel to that of St. Therese of Lisieux in France. We know, of course, all about Therese from her autobiography, which was translated into English as The Story of the Soul. But it is possible to make comparisons between these two marvelous women who died around the same age. Not unlike Therese, Gemma's life was a progressive immersion in the Passion of Jesus. And Gemma's experience of God from childhood to adulthood was centered on the passion of Jesus and participating in his redemptive suffering. Gemma lost her mother at the age of 8, and then a favorite brother of hers died at the age of 17. 2 years later, when she was 19, her father died, and the remaining children were gradually taken care of by different extended family members. Gemma herself was welcomed into the home of the Giannini family, who treated her like one of their own daughters. So we can honestly say Gemma was familiar with suffering from an early age, and at the same time was attracted to the sufferings of Jesus, particularly in his passion, and a growing awareness of his immense love for her and for all humanity. She developed a great desire to share with him in his sufferings for the redemption of other people, that they too might come to experience his immense love and compassion for them. Looking at Gemma's deepening spiritual life and growing love for Jesus and for his Blessed Mother from an early age, we might be tempted to say, she was always a holy person, that she persistently practiced compassion and love for her fellow human beings. But that wouldn't be entirely correct, and most certainly was not how Gemma saw herself. Most people that knew her, particularly Father Germano, her spiritual director, tell us that she held a very genuine, humble opinion of herself. She sincerely believed herself to be a sinner who, in her growing awareness of the immensity of Christ's love for her and for all people, increasingly saw the depths of her own selfishness and sincerely grieved and shed tears over what she saw as her puny and poor response to God's love. She accused herself frequently of sin and half-heartedness. Having looked at the wider tradition of the Church, we see how Gemma finds her place in the great procession of saints who practice loving communion with God and shed real tears and desired repentance for any sin or part of their soul that wasn't given completely to God, that didn't allow God's holiness to shine right through them. Unlike people of our day who go on television to boast of their wrongdoing, the saints are vividly aware of the evil of sin and anything that prevents them from being totally possessed by God's redemptive light. St. Gemma, as I say, over the course of her life, came to realize just how much Christ loved her and wished to share his divine life. And she had an accompanying desire to burn in return with love of him. So there developed, like Therese of Lisieux, a desire to imitate in his suffering for the salvation of others. But she'd learned a fundamental lesson from the start, as we all must. She knew the depths of her own weakness and her need for the strength of God. For St. Gemma, this was no pious pretense, but the very moment-to-moment sustenance of her life. I've a hunch that Gemma would have found it relatively easy to live at peace in a time of pandemic. Why? Because essentially she was at peace with herself and lived for Jesus alone. Like Saint Therese, of whom it was said she never had God more than 3 minutes away from her feelings and desires, Gemma was rather like that too. Throughout her life, illness was a frequent companion, and prevented, so much so that it prevented her from becoming a Passionist nun and being accepted as a candidate. In addition, Gemma suffered from spinal meningitis from around about 1899, catching the disease just after it took her brother's life. But she felt she was miraculously cured of it a few months later. Of course, there were people around her who were very cynical about her having had that disease, and even more cynical about and skeptical about her having a miraculous cure. It has to be said, Gemma lived a very private, hidden life, and never left any outstanding legacy in buildings or foundations, or created any movement, nor did she leave any human achievement to make her known beyond her small circle of neighbors and friends, at least on a human level. We owe a great deal of what we know about her to the fact that her spiritual director, a Passionist priest, encouraged her to write about her experience, and he believed she was authentic and holy, because there were plenty of people who did not share this positive assessment of Gemma. On the contrary, they thought her deluded and perhaps mentally unstable. And she suffered from that too, and those judgments. As I have said, Gemma's life is marked by a vivid participation in the Passion of Jesus, and she did share in his sufferings and agony, and had vivid, real insights into what he went through that up to the time of his death. Accordingly, she too suffered a lot of mental and physical pain in union with him. But she was most willing to do that for the love of sinners and their salvation. There are other saints who have loved her greatly and devoured her writing and descriptions of her spiritual experience. For instance, Padre Pio, Saint Pio Pietrelcina, who also, as you remember, mystically shared and physically shared in the Passion of Jesus. He bore the 5 wounds of Jesus in his body. And throughout his life, Padre Pio often quoted Gemma's writing, and he would share excerpts of her writings with his correspondents. Let's ask a basic question. What is it to share in the life, in the Passion of Jesus? This is surely a basic question for all of us Christians. Does it mean, for instance, having explicit mystical experiences and visions to follow Jesus in his suffering that led to his death? I don't think so. For most of us, it is simply to obey the gospel message which Matthew articulates in chapter 16, verse 24. If anyone seeks to be a follower of mine, let him take up his cross and follow me. Even the first followers of Jesus, you remember the first disciples, couldn't get it into their heads that he was going to die and rise. And it was only after the resurrection that they gradually realized that they too were meant to give their lives away in imitation of Jesus. And they called this sharing in the death and resurrection of Jesus. They could have made other options, but they saw, like pursuing money, wealth, power, control of other people. But St. Paul the Apostle is one of the first people to articulate this sharing in the sufferings of Jesus that every Christian undergoes. And his vivid realization that it is by baptism we share in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and are given the power of the Holy Spirit to share in God's life despite our weakness, and to follow in the footsteps of compassion for others. Paul was able to write in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. To follow in this path, each one of us must beg the help of God each day to accept ourselves and to love ourselves in our weakness and failings, and to strive and love and accept other people as they are, faithfully and perseveringly, however weakly we may feel we do it. Mother Teresa reminds us that the gospel never asks us to be successful, but simply to be faithful. I'm thinking now of the elderly people stuck in their homes during COVID, feeling lonely, isolated, and afraid, walking with the Lord in his loneliness and abandonment on the cross. I'm thinking of families and children stuck in the house for days on end and needing great patience and tolerance to live in peace and forgiveness. I'm thinking of people who have no employment and no immediate hope of finding work, and they having to deal with their frustration and sense of impotence, finding strength in the Lord to keep it together and be at peace moment by moment. This is the stuff of our walking on the way of the cross and sharing in the passion of Jesus. Pope Francis tells us that God comes to us in Jesus in our weakness and poverty, precisely because Jesus was a real, bona fide human being, suffering pain and limitation, knowing negative and positive emotions and feelings, and that he took all this with him on the cross and rose victorious from the grave. And so now he can be our strength in adversity and pain because he knows what we're talking about. He can be our strength in adversity if we open our lives to him, as he ceaselessly during his entire life opened his life to God and preeminently surrendered himself on the cross. Saints like Saint Gemma are living examples to us who are trying to be followers of Jesus. They are witnesses to the fact that the Lord is our strength and our daily help in times of adversity and challenging situations, including those of the long prolonged pandemic lockdowns. We must never forget, though, that there is also the mystery of God's presence in our lives. There are saints who have walked the walk, and Gemma has something to say to us about this deep, real, vivid reality. And she writes, "Often I seem to be alone, but really I have Jesus as my companion." And then she turns to Jesus and she says, "I am the fruit of your passion, Jesus, born of your wounds. O Jesus, seek me in love. I no longer possess anything. You have stolen my heart."